Nothing beats getting back an official information at request where you've just requested communications, because even if it doesn't go anywhere in terms of a story, it's always a lot of fun to just read people's emails that they may not have expected to end up in the public domain.
It is mostly, that's a pretty good description of a journalist's job, is just see what's going on. Just have a look. Today I'm talking to Bulletin editor Stewart Sowman-Lund. Stewart has had a few roles at the Spinoff, first as live updates editor, then reporter, and now as Bulletin editor. Writing a bulletin every morning takes up plenty of his time, but he also specialises in following those random one-off tips that journalists tend to receive. This week's tip was from a man who had strangely been called by the police while driving to tell him to stop using his phone while driving. Here's Stewart Sowman-Lund on Behind the Story. Kia ora, Stewart. Thanks for being here.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
This seemed immediately right up your alley, just like weird police encounter. Do you get many messages like that, or kind of random leads from strangers?
Yeah, I get a few, and I think it's because they are what I write about a lot. And I think what's fun about them is that, you know, as a journalist, I obviously like to write about the news, but a lot of these sorts of stories are not necessarily news in the traditional sense that, you know, I'm going to be breaking some massive scandal, although obviously if anyone's got one, feel free to DM me. But they are new. It's something that people may not be aware of. They probably haven't heard about, but it is clearly something that's happening. And so in the case of this story, I'd never heard of a police officer making direct contact with a driver while they were on the road to tell them off. And I thought, well, that's a news story in a sort of spin-off way.
And you had this weird thing where you went to the police and they initially were like, we wouldn't do that. Which then, what do you do then? Because you've got one person saying, no, this happened, and then the police are like, no, it didn't.
Yeah, they were basically like, well, that's not common practice. Can you provide, you know, the phone number that the call was made from, which we did. And then they were like, oh yeah, that is a thing we do. But it's not something we do commonly, but it is a thing we do. So I think it's in that case, it was quite useful because it proved that even, you know, whoever was working on the police media desk that day probably didn't believe that this was a thing that was happening, which kind of adds to the story, makes it a little bit more interesting because it's clearly not a common practice. So therefore it's, more interesting, I think, for the reader.
You know, sometimes stories can just be, here's a weird thing that happened to one person, and you write it up assuming that maybe other people have experienced the same thing and just not talked about it, or people might be shocked to find out that it happens to even one person. Can you talk about any sort of stories you've had in the past where you've gone, oh, yep, that's an interesting story, or you've read someone else reporting on something and then suddenly someone's gotten in touch with you out of the blue being like, hey, you might want to look into this?
I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but if I'm thinking about something I've written about original reporting in the last couple of weeks would be around like the Ministry of Health puberty brief, which, that's something that's been bubbling away under the surface for months and months and months with seemingly no movement, despite a lot of promises being made about it. And so it was really a simple case of people were getting in touch going, you know, you've mentioned this in the past, or we've read reporting about this. Can we just get an update? And that's sort of where the start of that particular story, which I've done a few of those kind of ones, starts from just someone getting in touch to say, can you just see what's going on? And that often ends up to be a bit more, there's often a reason why something has not been, you know, reported for a while, things going on behind the scenes. So that's often a good starting point.
That was you had submitted an OAA for communications about the Ministry of Health's sort of updated guidance on puberty blockers, which is still not out.
Yeah, still nothing. But nothing beats getting back an official information at request where you've just requested communications, because even if it doesn't go anywhere in terms of a story, it's always a lot of fun to just read people's emails that they may not have expected to end up in the public domain.
That is, it is mostly, that's a pretty good description of a journalist's job, is just see what's going on. Just have a look.
Yeah. And it's just that thing of, if people want to know something, if people are getting in touch with me saying, can you just see what's going on, whether it's a massive story or, a few lines in the bulletin, it's just being able to put something back out there, start a conversation again. In the last week, I did a bulletin about buy now, pay later schemes, not particularly timely, but still sort of newsworthy. And then later in the day, probably a coincidence, but, that was being discussed in Parliament. So it's like there are just pulling little nuggets out of different areas and going, maybe we should start a conversation about this.
And that's through the bulletin where you are sending Monday to Friday an email bulletin out to tens of thousands of readers who do read it. How has that been kind of going from writing for the site, which is fairly, it sits on the site. You can see that people are reading it if you look at the analytics, but you don't know necessarily specifically who, to being almost kind of in direct contact with quite a lot of readers who I'm sure respond to your emails or maybe ask you to look into something. How has it been to have that kind of like quite direct audience now?
Yeah, it was a bit of an adjustment because as a writer, you write in there's a certain tone you use when you're writing a news story versus a newsletter, where obviously I do want it to feel a little bit like a two-way conversation, which means that, I'm writing about 5 topics a week, five main topics, a lot of other topics involved in those. I might not get everything right every time. I'm obviously striving for that, but that's why it's good that audience is there and that they are ready to engage, because it means that they'll quite happily say, I think you could have looked at this, or have you considered looking at it from this angle, or just sometimes you've spelt a word wrong. And that helps me to learn, but it also means I'll then respond to the person, acknowledging that or engaging in a little bit of a discussion around their particular viewpoint. So it's quite a good sounding board. It's quite nice to have that sort of two-way conversation with the reader that you don't get necessarily unless you read the Facebook comments on a normal news story.
Most writers at the Spinoff have written for the Spinoff for the site. Standalone stories between 800 and endless words. You are sort of a rarity in that you have written, or you have had jobs that have required quite unique writing approaches. So your first job being live updates editor, which was very much short summaries of what's going on, quick updates, constant rolling coverage. Then you have standard reporting, which is kind of what most people are doing, is like standalone pieces written, put up on the site. And then now you are bulletin editor, which again is its own format. It's got its own tone and it's on a completely different platform. It's an email. Do you have a preference of how you would rather tell stories? Because these are all storytelling, but they're in very, very different ways.
Yeah, I came into journalism as I did a small stint in sort of digital reporting, but primarily my first role was in radio, which is really short, snappy. You get about 16 seconds to tell a story for a news bulletin. And then coming to live updates was sort of a little bit longer than that. But I've actually really fallen in love with the ability to have a longer word count where it feels necessary and to really get stuck into something. So when the opportunity to, piece together multiple sources and put together a really substantive feature comes along, that is just I find the most, invigorating, because you get that ability to tell the story properly. There's no chance for, missing out something because you're confined to a particular word count or time.
Are there any stories that you can think of that you would say encapsulate that of your own? Because I think most people, because you were the live updates editor for quite a while and then also the bulletin editor, people may assume that that's most of what you've done. But you've actually done a lot of standalone reporting and feature writing. Do you want to kind of like shout out any that you feel like fit your kind of preferred topic and format?
I think the investigation I did into the Auckland restaurant Cotto at the start of this year was probably the perfect example of that, because it's a long-form feature, but it was also an exclusive news story, which is not necessarily something you often get the chance to sort of merge together. You often, you're doing a long-form feature on, a broad topic, or you're doing quite a short, snappy, exclusive breaking story. But because this was a story that I was pretty comfortable, I was the only one working on in the media, it meant I had the time to develop it out into quite a meaty feature while also having a lot of news elements in there, and that ended up getting picked up by other outlets, which is always, a nice thing to see happen. So that would definitely be one. And then I did a couple of quite weird news stories about a little Invercargill Facebook page about 2 years ago maybe, called What's on Invis, which I really enjoyed doing for the same reason, because it was something that 90% of the country probably had no idea about because it's an Invercargill community group. But it was still a news story, but it allowed me to dive into it in quite a lot of depth because I was explaining something to a really broad audience, not just people from that part of the country.
And now you're having to cover all sorts of topics because the Bulletin, by its very nature, is like wrapping up everything that's going on in New Zealand media and news. Have you found that by writing the Bulletin, you've kind of been exposed to or learned about some topics that are now quite interesting to you that maybe you hadn't even really considered before then?
Yeah, absolutely, because there are some days where it's so obvious what we're going to be talking about the next day. So, yesterday, GDP, it was obviously going to be GDP. So on Wednesday, I was able to prepare for the Thursday Bulletin because that was clearly going to be the defining news story. But there are days where there isn't really an overarching story or theme. And so it is about kind of plucking out topics that I feel are still have some relevance. They're still in the sort of broader mindset, but they're not necessarily breaking or developing stories. And so I have had to kind of dig deep to learn about, the economy is definitely one. The economy as a whole is something I did not know a lot about. And I feel now that I'm, reasonably comfortable reading and actually understanding what I'm reading when I'm, going through a lot of sources. Or we've seen issues with, the workforce and mills closing and just these sorts of issues that normally I would engage with just as a viewer of the 6 o'clock news and go, okay, that's an interesting thing that's happened. And I would, know that it had happened, but now having to kind of come to it, speaking to an audience of thousands as someone who actually kind of understands, or at least, thinks I understand those topics in enough depth to make it an interesting read. So I think I'm always learning, which is one part of the job that I really love.
Not to get all Duncan Grieve presenting the fold in this podcast, but you do read a lot of New Zealand media, and I know you've been doing the Bulletin for nearly 6 months now, so it's not a super, super long time, but have you noticed any change in the media that you are reading? Have you noticed any sort of dropping off in certain areas, or maybe a surprising boost in some areas?
So I started just before NewsHub closed, which meant that, it was only a few weeks into the role, or maybe a couple of months into the role, where it felt like quite a substantial amount of the news that I was engaging with disappeared because I was such an avid NewsHub watcher. So that was an interesting thing, having to try and, change my natural approach to where I would go to for certain stories. Thankfully, a lot of those fantastic journalists have been picked up by other outlets. And I think that's the other thing about the job that I've had to learn quite quickly is, as someone who does watch and read a lot of news, you do quite quickly learn or, reaffirm who you can trust and who, because I'm presenting multiple different sources to a readership and trying to condense it down, but at the same time, I'm needing to pick the sources that I want to include. And so it is useful to kind of know, okay, here are a bunch of journalists that if I see their name pop up before a column or before a report, I think I can trust them to be, a fairly substantive piece of the Bulletin. And that's been really helpful.
Do you want to give any of them a shout out? It's in the interest of the Bulletin being one of the few places in New Zealand media that is focused on essentially directing people to other outlets.
Yeah, and I
feel like shouting them out.
Yeah, definitely, because I do love that bit about it, that I'm not confined to just writing about the spin-off. Obviously, love to shout the spin-off out, but, if I see a Thomas Coughlin piece at the Herald or a Dan Brunskill piece from Interest, or I still love seeing Jenna Lynch still being on the news, even though it's not News Hub anymore, those are some of the names that I instantly know. They're going to have an interesting angle or a good perspective on something that's worth feeding in to, to a bulletin on a particular topic.
Oh, and if you are listening and going, what is the Bulletin? You can subscribe. Just literally Google the Bulletin, the spin-off, and you'll be able to subscribe. It is sent out every morning, mostly right on around 7 a.m, Monday to Friday, written by Stewart Sowman-Lund. Thank you, Stewart, for being on here today.
Thank you.
That was Stewart Sowman-Lund on Behind the Story. I'll be back next week with another spin-off writer and another spin-off yarn. Thanks for listening.